With Perek Dalet, and you'll recall that the Rambam is given many examples of what is called the Dil HaZahav, the golden mean. Again, I want to repeat, the Rambam does not use that term. That is how others refer to it, which is really a Hebrew translation of Aristotle. Aristotle, golden mean. It's translated in medieval philosophy as Shavil HaZahav, which really means the golden road. But the Rambam does not use that term, but he still very much advocates the notion that you're not supposed to go to extremities. And it's interesting that he gives quite a few examples, and I just counted them. There's actually 10 different examples of good midot, and then the Rambam describes which is the extremity on either side. Some of them are quite difficult to distinguish. They seem indistinguishable in some ways. Let me just list the midos as emerges from the Shmona Prakim. The first 4 or 5 we had gone over yesterday. You'll recall that midah number 1 is called zehirus. Now, zehirus normally means caution, but it's very clear from the extremities that that's not what the Rambam means. The Rambam says the extremities are too much of an indulgence in taiva versus not getting pleasure from the world. Those are your extremes. The middle is called zehirus, in which one enjoys the world within reasonable bounds. Right? That's midah number 1. Midah number 2 is nedivus. Now, I translated nedivus to mean generosity, which is what it normally means. However, in context, that does not appear to be what the Rambam means by nedivus. Nedivus simply means a willingness to spend money when money should be spent. Because the Rambam says the extremes of nedivus are kilos, which is being a miser, and hispazrus is irresponsibly scattering your money around. So nedivus is not so much generosity as it is using your money in a reasonable way, versus being stingy and versus being irresponsibly wasting your money. So that's zehirus, that's nedivus. The third midah tova is gevura, which is understood here not as strength but as courage. And the extremes are, the bad one is mesira l'sakana. That means recklessly endangering yourself for no reason. And the opposite is cowardice. So the balance between cowardice and mesira l'sakana is the quality of gevura, which is reasonable courage. The fourth midah is called silsul, which essentially means taking care of yourself, meaning being concerned with your external appearance. And the extremes here are hisnasos, where you become kind of a fashion person who's totally concerned with chitzonius, versus navala, in which you have no care at all for your chitzonius. And silsul is the moderate care for your body. The fifth is called nachas. Now, nachas here does not mean like nachas for children. Nachas seems to be calmness, a calm temperament, meaning you take things in stride and you don't get overly upset. So here the opposites are kitrug, in which you want to pick a fight over everything, kitrug, and the other is rakos hatever, you're so indifferent to life, kind of it's a form of depression, that nothing, as it were, ever gets you excited. So that's a chisaron. Nachas is calmness, in which you do get affected by things, but you're in more of a calm temperament. The sixth midah is anava. Anava is humility. The opposite extreme is gaiva, and the opposite extreme in the other direction is called shiflus, in which you think you're worthless. Now, this is a very important point. Anava is not a contradiction to self-esteem. A person has to recognize their greatness, their milas, their kochos, the fact that God gave them a mission. If a person truly thinks they're dirt and they're worthless, they're never going to accomplish anything. So that is what is called shiflus. So gaiva is no good, and shiftless. When you have the appropriate level of self-esteem, but you're still humble and non-arrogant, that is what is called the midah of anava. Okay, so instead of looking at shiftless as a higher level of anava, the Rambam says shiftless is actually a destructive evil quality, and therefore you need to have a balance. The seventh is Histopkus. Histopkus, again, a lot of these seem to overlap. This means you are mistapek b'muat, meaning you are satisfied in life with a relatively simple life. You don't need a lot of stuff. You're happy b'muat. We know that one of the qualities of the Torah, the 48 ways that you acquire the Torah, is mistapek b'muat. You are happy with relatively little. The opposite is called avas hamamon, greed. And the opposite of that is atzlus, laziness. Now this is very fascinating. Sometimes a person might be mistapek b'muat simply because they don't want to put any effort into anything. They're lazy. So they're lazy, right? So they sleep in a car or they sleep in a box. And they say, I'm mistapek b'muat, when in fact they don't want to work. Right? So the Rambam says, avas hamamon is a very bad thing, and laziness is a very bad thing. But the middle balance between being obsessed with making money versus just being too lazy to do anything is a midah that's called histopkus, in which I will, work to take care of my family, but I'm happy with a relatively simple lifestyle. This is an important idea because, the truth of the matter is that in Western society, certainly in the United States, there was always a goal to make as much money as you can. I mean, that's kind of a basic orientation. You're offered a promotion, of course you take it. The promotion may require that you work more hours. Well, how can I turn it down? I will make more money. And even in the front world, even in the Torah world, the goal is to make as much money as possible. One of the things that one has to understand is that making as much money as possible is not necessarily a priority in life. Your priority is to take care of my family, to have time to learn and to do mitzvahs, and to spend time with my family. If that means making a decision that I will make less money, then in many cases that is the right decision to make. Now, if you couldn't make enough money to support your family, that would be a different issue. You may have to engage in a sacrifice at one level or the other. But generally speaking, one does not say my priority in life is to make as much money as I'm able to make. So the Rambam says the midah tova here is called histopkus. Histopkus is to be satisfied with what you have. The extremities to be avoided are avas hamamon versus atzlus. Yeah.
Would that the general principle also apply to, let's say, somebody who's like a philanthropist or like a Rosh Yeshiva, for example, like where any more dollar that you would get would benefit other people, like a fundraiser or like.
Well, again, histopkus itself is a relative term. Histopkus means I'm happy if I have what I need. So the question is, what do you need? That's all. Meaning to say, if I need a yeshiva, then I'll need more money for that yeshiva. So that's nichlal in kind of focusing on what are the needs that I have, both in terms of my needs and the needs of my community, and then I have to make a cheshbon as to how much effort is going to be required. Of course, Hashem is the source of your parnasa, but you have to engage in hishtadlus, and the hishtadlus will be the amount of effort you need in order to be zocha to the bracha of Hashem. All of the Svarim tell us that because hishtadlus does not have a direct cause and effect, meaning you don't make money because you work. You make money because Hashem decreed that on Rosh Hashanah you are entitled to a certain amount of parnasa. But you're not going to get it without working, because ever since the chait of the Eitz Hadas, Hashem decreed a punishment on man, that that you will eat your bread by the sweat of your brow. This is called hishtadlus. So hishtadlus does not directly get you the parnasa. Hishtadlus is kind of a condition for Hashem to give you the bracha that He already set aside for you. Now, this is not just semantic. This actually explains that sometimes you could be doing your effort in one direction and the money comes from a totally other direction. In fundraising, this is often the case. Let's imagine you're collecting money, you're a Rosh Yeshiva, you're collecting money for a yeshiva, your yeshiva. So you go to 100 people and you get nothing. And then in the mail, you get a check for $1 million, a person that you never even heard of. Now you might think, well, gee, that means my going to 100 people was an absolute waste of time because I got nothing from them and I got $1 million from somebody who I didn't even know. So did I waste I'm happy about that, but did I waste a week? The answer is you didn't waste a week. Hashem obviously paskined in Shemayim that this yeshiva is entitled to get $1 million. But there's a condition to get that $1 million, that you engage in a certain amount of effort. Seeing the 100 people is the effort that enabled you to get the $1 million from the unrelated source. Now, it's clearly not a cause and effect in a normal causal relationship. I didn't get the $1 million because I spoke to these people. But in a sense, it is in a spiritual way, because this was the hishtadlus that enabled me to open up the gates of bracha to get what Hashem has given to me. This is the curious idea of hishtadlus, that sometimes your hishtadlus has nothing to do with the benefit that you've gotten, but you still had to go through it because that was the gezerah of Hashem.
Is there more merit if your reward comes as a result of your efforts versus a surprise like getting a mail and check?
Yeah. So it's the same. In other words, the truth of the matter is, at that point, you're likely to convince yourself that it came because of your efforts. It's not so recognizable, but even then, it really works the same way. It really works the same way. In other words, sometimes Hashem lets you see it very clearly, such as the $1 million coming from a stranger, and sometimes it's not so clear, but the Metzias is the same Metzias in both cases. Rav Dessler talks about this idea that hishtadlus is a condition, it is not actually a cause. But again, Histopkus b'muat is a very, very important value for a Ben Torah to understand. And again, in some ways it's obvious, but in some ways it's very counterintuitive. I mean, we are raised from childhood that we're supposed to try to make as much money as we can, right? That's kind of what you do. And the short answer is that's not what you do necessarily. You look for a parnasa in which you can be mistapek b'muat, and at the same time take care of what you need to take care of. Okay, so that is number 7. Now number 8 is called tov lev. So again, the number 2 midah was called nedivus. This is why I'm changing what I said yesterday. Yesterday I translated nedivus as generosity towards others, but I think that's not the case, because 8 is tov lev, and that's generosity towards others. So that's towards others. That's why I said earlier, and I said it today, that nedivus, as used by the Rambam, does not refer to generosity per se. It just refers to willingness to spend money, even on yourself. Because the extremes of nedivus is miser versus irresponsible spending. Nedivus is the willingness to use your money for legitimate purposes. Okay, so that goes to what is your connection to money. The 8th midah, tov lev, is what is your connection to wanting to help people. Now that can either be by money, or by time, by efforts, by a million different ways. It's not dafka a money issue. It's simply a question of, do you have a good heart that cares about people and wants to help them? So here, the opposite extremes are Navala. A Naval is a despicable person who just doesn't care about other people. And not only doesn't care about them, well, it can come in two flavors. Sometimes you don't care, and sometimes you actually, if you're more sadistic, you actually enjoy having people suffer. But even if you're not that bad, I don't really care. I don't really care what happens to other people. That's called Naval. Naval, disgusting. And the opposite extreme, the Rambam says, there's no word in our language. And he says, it's just called too much of a good heart. So he says, there's good heart, there's naval, and then there's too much of a good heart. And the Rambam explains that sometimes a person is so altruistic and so giving that he may disregard his family, he may put himself in danger, he may put himself at great inconvenience, he may not be able to accomplish the things he is supposed to accomplish. Meaning a person has to have a certain amount of selfishness in life. This is my time to learn, this is my time to daven, this is my time to rest. And if a person is too much, it sounds funny, but too much into helping people no matter what, they're going to get burnt out. They tell a story, it's a very interesting story. Some people, when they hear the story, they gasp because it's so awful. And then if you think about it for a moment, you see it's not so awful. This was a description of Yerushalayim 70 years ago, 80 years ago. People were extremely poor, very, 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 very poor. And a woman had 8 children. She was a widow, all by herself, having to raise 8 children. And there was no food in the house except for one egg. One egg. 8 children. So she went into the bedroom and she ate the egg. So people hear that story, they say, what type of mom is that? I mean, your children are starving, they have no food to eat. There's one egg, and you ate the egg? But the explanation is this. Let's say I would have divided the egg into 8 pieces. So each kid would have had 1/8 of a hard-boiled egg. How much would that have sustained them? How much would that have satisfied them? How long would the pleasure last? A minute, nothing. But the woman says, I eat an egg. Now even that you see with the sacrifice. I eat an egg. I have energy to take care of them for the next 3 hours. I'll be a better mother. I will, play with them or look around for food for them. So there's a profound point here, and that is sometimes you do have to be selfish in order to be selfless. Meaning if you totally neglect what you need because you want to be there for others, what's going to happen is you're not going to be there for others because you're going to be depleted and you're going to be wiped out. So a mother of children must have time where she can be away from the kids. Right? Father, same thing. Husband and wife should have what's called date nights, meaning even after they're married and they have a big family, they still go out and spend some private time together. This is very important. And one shouldn't think, I'm abandoning my children, I'm leaving them alone, I'm not taking care of them. If you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be able to take care of others. This is a phenomenon that's in family life and learning and all sorts of things. A person's a Rebbe giving many shiurim. The person still has to learn by himself because that kind of replenishes him. Or a person goes to a shiur of someone higher than him, so to speak, because that way, he gets something that he can incorporate. So selfishness, I use it in a broad term, selfishness is sometimes necessary in order to be an effective giver. And that's why the Rambam says there is such a thing as having too much of a good heart. Not in the emotional sense. I mean, emotionally, as much as you can feel is a beautiful thing. But behaviorally and operationally, sometimes you need to hold back. And you need to focus on what you need because that will give you the strength and the energy. So, right, so this is Midah number 8, Tov Lev, caring about other people. The opposite extreme is Navala, I don't really care at all about what happens to people. And the other extreme, the Rambam says, we don't even have a word for it. Yisron Tov Lev, too much of a Lev Tov, in which you're not able to really help people because you are so depleted and so exhausted by all that you've given that there's nothing there to give anymore, right? So that's the number 8. Then number 9, the good midah is called savlanus. Savlanus is patience. Now here again, I have some problems. Midah number 5 was called nachas. Nachas meant calmness of spirit. And the extremes for nachas is kitrug, meaning wanting to fight. And the other extreme was being too indifferent to things, so nothing ever gets you excited. Right, that's for nachas. Now number 9 seems to be a very closely related idea. So I'm not sure I get the differences myself. And that's called savlanut, savlanus. Savlanut, which is a common term in modern Hebrew as well, refers to patience. And the opposite of patience in the negative way is anger. Things aren't going my way, I get angry. And the other, once again, is that coldness of spirit in which nothing affects you. So it's not clear to me what is the difference between patience and calmness. I mean, the Rambam enumerates them as different. Calm, meaning I don't get excited. Patience means I don't get angry. Could be, I mean, one could imagine scenarios. Not every agitation is anger. In other words, calmness simply means how do you respond when things don't go your way? So let's assume you're missing a bus or whatever it would be. So it may not be angry, it just may be anxious. Right? So the first element is calmness versus anxiety. The second is anger versus not being angry. But they're very, obviously they're very, very related in that way. And the 10th one, the last one that is mentioned, and here the Rambam does have a very interesting observation, is called Boshes Panim. Now Boshes Panim literally means embarrassment, but really it refers to kind of the notion of not wanting to project yourself as the center of attention. Boshes Panim is a good midah. I don't have to be the center of attention. I don't have to have people notice me all the time. Huh?
Sneeze?
It's like a sneeze. Now he says, the opposite of Boshes Panim is azus. Azus is arrogance. I gotta be front and center. And then he says, the other extreme is called a baishan. So this is an interesting linguistic analysis. The Rambam differentiates between the midah of Boshes Panim and the midah of baishanut. Baishanut is the extreme of Boshes Panim. Boshes Panim is the golden mean, where you have the appropriate reticence and tznius, as opposed to azus, where you're arrogant, and as opposed to baishanut, where you're kind of hiding under the table because you don't want anybody to see you. Now, the Rambam brings a very interesting proof to this linguistic distinction. Pirkei Avos says, Lo habaishan lomet. What does that mean? A person who is excessively timid or bashful will never be able to learn. Why is that? He'll be too embarrassed to ask questions. He will be too embarrassed to say he doesn't understand something because he doesn't want to hold up the class or inconvenience the Rebbe. So, when you're a baishan, you're not going to be able to learn Torah. That's a bad thing. The Rambam is medayek. It doesn't say, Lo Boshes Panim Lomed. Because Boshes Panim, which is the moderate sneers in the middle, is a good midah. It's only the Baishan that is the extremity that's going to be negative. Now, I do have a little kasha on the Rambam. If the Rambam is making such a big deal that there's a linguistic chiluk between Baishanus, which is the extremity of timidity, and Boshes Panim, which is the thing in the middle, that's right. What about the well-known Gemara? The Gemara says there are 3 simanim of the Jewish people. 3 good qualities that the Jewish people have. Baishanim, they're modest and reticent. Rachmanim, they are people that have compassion and mercy. Gomlei chasadim, and there are people who take that mercy and want to do actual chesed. These are the 3 signs of a true Jew. So what's the first one? Baishanim. But according to the Rambam, Baishanim is a negative because it represents an extremity of timidity. So I'm just raising a little ha'ara that at least you find in Chazal, that the word Baishan is not always used as a negative extremity. Sometimes it seems to be describing the ideal quality. Okay, as I say, in some ways, I'm not even sure how exact all these words are because we are reading them in translation. The Rambam wrote it in Arabic, and maybe in Arabic he used different words that don't correspond to the Hebrew. On the other hand, this seems to be something the Rambam is dealing with on the Hebrew level, because the Rambam brings the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, Lo ha-Baishan Lomed, to show that Baishan is a bad quality, even though in that Maimer Chazal of Baishanim, Rachmanim, Gaimlei Chasadim, the Baishan is good. So, B'kitzer, again, these are examples. We don't necessarily have to look at every example B'arichos, but the Rambam enumerates 10 qualities. We have 2 extremities. One, you have too much of the quality, and the other is you have too little of the quality, and one has to endeavor to kind of be in the middle and not be out of balance, so to speak, because that is called a choli hanefesh, that is called a sickness of the soul, and the only way you can repair a sickness of the soul is by restoring a balance. I'm sorry, you had a hand up, yeah.
Is it possible that the Rambam maybe took the idea of the golden mean like too far on some of them, and maybe some of the midot, like Aishanut or something, being an extremist, in that sense, being on one extreme, is actually not bad? Or is it like...
Yeah. Well, the truth of the matter is, there does seem to be a little bit of a stira here. The Rambam does write in Hilchos Deos that humility is not a golden mean. One should go to the extreme of humility to whatever degree possible. And yet, Beferish here in the Shmona Prakim, he writes that Anava also has an extreme that is called shiftless. So, B'pashtus, there is a contradiction, and it could be that Rambam rethought in time that maybe certain midas should not be subject to the golden mean. That's a good question. But at least here, although the Rambam even here is going to qualify that in a moment, that's the next thing we're going to look at. Here the Rambam is a strong advocate of balance, and once again, keep in mind, he is using medical analogies. He is saying sickness of the soul has to be treated the same way as sickness of the body. Sicknesses of the body come from imbalance, where there's too much of one type of thing and too little of something else. So you gotta build it up so they're in equilibrium. The Rambam says soul sickness works the same way. It's when you're out of whack, you're out of sync. There's too much of something when things should be equally balanced. And therefore the Rambam basically says that soul healing follows the same type of pattern as medical healing. And the Rambam made the point that just as when you're physically sick, you go to a doctor, when you are spiritually sick, you go to the doctors of the soul, and they are the Chachamim who have the teachings of the Torah to help us cure the sicknesses of our soul.
Sorry to ask you, but is it like his whole idea of healing spiritual sickness is based on a balance. Is it possible that it's based on, I mean, Chas v'shalom, that it's based on the idea of doctrine of humors, like where?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it is.
Which is like it's not true, right?
Well, let me put it this way. The particular doctrine of the four humors and being out of balance, four fluids, the white fluid, the red fluid, the black fluid, the green fluid, whatever it is, we don't describe the body that way. But the notion of out of whack, out of balance, actually is a very, very relevant concept, even in modern health. So the particulars of the description are less important than the conceptual underpinning, meaning the notion that when the systems of the body are not balanced in a right way, there will be distortions. That happens to be true, even in modern medicine, although we will describe it in different vocabularies, right? So I think in that sense, this concept is not superseded by different understandings. I mean, you have to understand, when you read a passage in the Rambam, where the Rambam refers to the four humors, in fact, he mentions them, the particulars are not as important as an underlying concept which continues to be valid. I had given you an example from the Gemara itself about mazel. Remember, the Gemara says, Masechah Shabbos, that if you're born under the mazel, the planet of Mars, Madim, the red planet, which is Mars, your nature will be to shed blood. But you can be a mohel, or a shochet, or a murderer. Now, sometimes our first reaction when I read that Gemara, what is our mind drawn to? Oh, constellations, astrology, primitive pseudoscience. We don't believe that. How could Chazal believe in astrology? That's kind of what hits your eye. Now, that's a separate issue. The Rambam, in point of fact, actually says astrology is false. The Ibn Ezra says it's true. But the point is, the teaching of that Gemara does not rise or fall on the truth of astrology. That's just the example. Basically, it is dealing with the idea that we are born a certain way. There's part of our natures that are hardwired, and we could call that astrology, or we could call it DNA. In other words, the fact that you locate it in a different source doesn't change the idea. And the main point of the Gemara is, how do you superimpose free will on those aspects of my personality that are predetermined? Because after all, if I'm born a certain way, then where is my free will? Now, Chazal used the vocabulary of mazel to describe how you're born. We'll use a different vocabulary. The question is exactly the same. Does genetic determinism take away free will? And the Talmud's answer is, it does not. Because it may determine your tendencies, but you have free will to direct your tendencies to the positive or the negative. Again, that's not our context here, but I'm bringing it in to show that sometimes the particular scientific references do not really determine the validity of the underlying teaching. And I think in the case of the balance would be the same issue here. Okay, so this is the famous golden mean, Shavil HaZahav, although that is not the Lashon the Rambam uses. The Rambam holds of it a lot. As I say, the main source for it is indeed Aristotle, but the Rambam locates siyua, assistance from various Mamari Chazal. So you can't really say Chazal openly discuss this. That would be too much of a claim, but you can find support in Chazal to the central idea. But this is an idea the Rambam actually, well, I'm not going to say he got it from Aristotle. It could be that he just agreed with Aristotle. But the Rambam is saying it as something that he regards as very, very fundamental. So now, though, the Rambam introduces an extremely important point. And the extremely important point is that sometimes, in order to achieve balance, you need to go to the extreme. And the example, the famous example he gives, is you have a tree. You want the tree to grow straight. Let's imagine the tree is bent over at a 90-degree angle or something like that, and you want it to be straight. If I simply push the trunk to be straight, it'll keep on going back to some degree. So in order for me to get it into the middle, I got to push it, assuming it's a young tree that you could bend, I have to bend it to the other extreme. So there's a force pulling it down that way. So then when you have the force pulling it the other way, because of its original positioning, it'll wind up in the middle. Meaning sometimes you need to take extreme measures to get you away from an extreme that is moving in the opposite direction. So let's take, for example, the Nazir. Now, generally speaking, the Rambam indeed brings the Chazal. In fact, this would be a proof for the golden mean a little bit, that a Nazir is treated, what is a Nazir? A Nazir is a person who accepts upon himself, through a vow, a certain state where he's not allowed to drink wine, not allowed to cut hair, and not allowed to become tameh to a dead body, even a relative. Right? These are the laws of a Nazir. You can be a Nazir for a short time or for a long time. The minimum duration of a Nazirus is 30 days. You could actually make yourself a Nazir for your whole life. Right? Nazirus can be anything from 30 days up. Now, at the conclusion of the Nazirus, the Nazir brings a bunch of korbanos. And the question is, why does a Nazir need to bring korbanos? And Rabbi Elazar HaKapor says, he's a Tana, that every Nazir is a sinner. Why is he a sinner? Because he deprived himself from a legitimate pleasure the Torah wanted him to have. The Torah didn't forbid me to drink wine. The Torah wants me to drink wine. I get simcha. I do mitzvahs with it. So the Nazir is being a bigger tzaddik than the Torah. Right? The way in the Rambam's language, he's going to the extreme of separation from pleasure of the world. Because of that, he is a sinner, and that's why he has to bring a korban. Now, just as a little aside, I want to point out that the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra bring an opposite opinion. This is very, very fascinating. They say, you know why the Nazir is a sinner? Because he's experiencing the holiness of Nazirus. And now he wants to leave it. The sin is not becoming the Nazir. The sin is after you taste Kedusha. How could you go back into the ordinary world? That's a fascinating machlokas. According to Rabbi Elazar HaKapor, which is the opinion Rashi follows, Rashi brings Rabbi Elazar HaKapor, the sin of the Nazir is becoming a Nazir. According to Ramban and Ibn Ezra, the sin of the Nazir is leaving the exalted spiritual status. Rambam follows the view that Rashi espouses. Again, it's from Rabbi Elazar HaKapor, that the sin of Nazirus is excessively withdrawing from the legitimate pleasures of the world. Right? So that is what Rashi says. Again, it goes back to Rabbi Elazar HaKapor. So, normally we would look at Nazir as an example of the extremism which you need to get away from and be in the middle. And yet, the Gemara in Nedarim brings a story about Shmona Tzaddik. Right? Our namesake of our street, Kever. Shmona Tzaddik was a great, great Kohen Gadol at the very beginning, towards the beginning of the Bayis Sheni. He was the first Kohen Gadol after the end of Tanakh. Meaning Tanakh ends, new period begins. Shmona Tzaddik was, in fact, his father is the last Kohen Gadol mentioned in Tanakh, in the book of Nehemiah. Yadua? Of course, Shmona Tzaddik is not mentioned, but Shmona Tzaddik is right after the biblical period, the time of Alexander conquering the land of Israel. You know the famous story that he wanted to destroy the Beis HaMikdash so the Jews wouldn't rebel, and Shmona Tzaddik came to request him not to. And when Alexander saw Shmona Tzaddik, he got off his horse and he bowed down and he said, You're the person I see in all my dreams. That tells me if I'll be victorious or not. And Yerushalayim was spared because of Shmona Tzaddik. And that year, every Jewish boy that was born in Eretz Yisrael was given the name Alexander. And that is how Alexander has become a Hebrew name, so to speak, that you can call people to the Torah with. It dates from that time. Alexander is a Greek name, but through that Maaseh it got introduced within the Jewish people. But Shmona Tzaddik says, I never ate from the korban of a Nazir, because Nazirs are sinners. But there was one Nazir from whom I ate, and it mentions he was a fellow who was a narcissist, actually similar to the story of Narcissus, that he was a person with beautiful hair, and he was very pretty, and he would be looking at his reflection, and he wanted to live a life of znus, become a male prostitute. And then he realized this was not the derech, it was makabel naziris, and he had to, after he let his hair grow long, he had to shave his hair. And he did it l'shem shamayim, to break his yetzer hara. So Shmona Tzaddik said, that Nazir is not a sinner. That Nazir is a tzaddik. Meaning to say, if a person has bad habits, a person's an alcoholic, sometimes an alcoholic might have to go to the extreme of never taking a drink again. Sometimes that can be temporary. Sometimes it may even have to be permanent. But the Rambam makes the point that sometimes when a person is at a certain extreme of negativity, the only way they can fix themselves is by going to the other extreme. And therefore, even though the ultimate goal is moderation, the ultimate goal is in the middle, but there are times in life that you reach the middle only by going in the other direction. Right? So that's a very important point, that when I have to break a bad midah, I may have to go. So the Rambam gives examples. If a person is extremely selfish and they want to train themselves in benevolence and kindness, and that goes back to the idea that repetitive action, right, changes your emotion. You may have to be excessively generous. Give more than a fifth. Give everything away till it stops bothering you. And then you can move back into the middle. Yeah, one final question.
I was going to bring up, what about the Rambam saying small actions, but small repetitive actions change your personality compared to this big one where you need to...
No, well, that's very true. Meaning, see, it's not a contradiction. Even when you're going to the extreme, you may do so in small increments. Meaning to say, whenever I'm confronted with having to give, I will give something. I won't give everything all at once, but I will never withhold myself from giving. Okay, you have a really nice trip.